My name is Gerald Haynes, and I am 64 years old. The day I finally stopped pretending everything was fine was the day I walked into my bank, closed the joint savings account my son had convinced me to open with him 3 years ago, and transferred every remaining dollar to a private account he would never find. 4 hours later, my front door swung open without a single knock, and my son stood in the entryway with his wife right behind him, both of them trembling with a rage they had no right to feel. My son demanded to know why his debit card had just been declined at a luxury furniture showroom downtown. He was standing there, red-faced and shaking, waiting for an old man to apologize. I set down my reading glasses, folded my hands on the kitchen table, and told him exactly what I had done. Before I explain how every single piece of their comfortable world came apart that afternoon, let me ask you something. Which city are you watching from? Leave it in the comments below, and hit the like button if you believe a father's life savings should belong to the father. Subscribe to the channel if you think respect inside a family should never be optional. My son's name is Derek. He is 38 years old and has his mother's eyes and absolutely none of her integrity. My wife, Carol, passed away from cancer 4 years ago, after 31 years of marriage. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, kept the kitchen warm, and never once asked for anything she had not already given 10 times over. When we lost her, I lost the person who had quietly kept our family honest. What followed her death was a slow and deliberate education in who my son had quietly become while I was busy grieving. Derek called me 2 weeks after the funeral. He said he was worried about me living alone in the house Carol and I had shared for 22 years. He said a man my age, dealing with that kind of loss, should not be managing finances by himself. He came over for dinner one evening with his wife, Pamela, and the two of them sat across from me at the same table where Carol used to fold laundry, and suggested I add Derek to my primary savings account so he could help me monitor things. I was 60 years old, a retired civil engineer with 47 years of disciplined financial habits, and my son was suggesting I needed a babysitter for my own money. But I was also a man who had just buried his wife and was eating dinner alone for the first time in 3 decades. So I said yes. I should have recognized the precision in the timing. I should have understood that grief is the most dangerous vulnerability a person can carry, because the people who want to exploit you know exactly when you are too exhausted to fight back. I handed Derek access to an account containing $240,000 in life savings, the proceeds from Carol's life insurance policy, and my monthly pension deposit of $4,200. I trusted my only son with everything his mother and I had spent a lifetime building. For the first 6 months, Derek did exactly what he promised. He texted me grocery receipts. He updated me on the account balance. He called every Sunday. And then, gradually, the calls became less frequent. The texts stopped arriving. When I asked questions, the answers were vague and cheerful and designed to redirect my attention. When I asked Derek directly why the balance seemed lower than I expected, he laughed and told me he had reinvested a portion into a high-yield opportunity he was managing on my behalf. He told me not to worry. He said the money was working for us now instead of just sitting still. I am a civil engineer. I spent 40 years calculating load tolerances and stress fractures in concrete and steel. I understand better than most people that the most dangerous failures in any structure are not the ones that happen suddenly. They are the ones that develop slowly, invisibly, deep inside the foundation, while everything on the surface still looks perfectly solid. I started keeping my own records in a green spiral notebook I stored inside a box of old engineering manuals on the bottom shelf of my home office bookcase. Every time I checked the online account balance, I wrote the number down with the date and time. I did that for 4 months. When I drew a line connecting the numbers, the picture was unmistakable. The account was draining at a rate that had nothing to do with groceries or utilities, or the reasonable cost of managing a retired man's modest lifestyle. Over 14 months, Derek and Pamela had quietly removed $163,000 from my savings. I did not call Derek. I did not send an angry text message. I did not slam my notebook shut and drive to his house to demand answers. I am a man who spent his career identifying the exact location of a structural weakness before applying any corrective force. If you push on the wrong point, you accelerate the collapse before you are ready to contain it. So I spent 3 additional weeks documenting every single withdrawal I could access, cross-referencing the dates with things I knew had happened in their lives. A weekend in Las Vegas in February. The new kitchen renovation Pamela had mentioned at Thanksgiving. The private preschool tuition for their daughter that Derek had once casually mentioned they could not quite afford on his salary alone. I built the case slowly, carefully, the way I would build a bridge. Every rivet in place before the structure bore any weight. The morning I finally walked into the bank and closed the account, I also carried with me a manila folder containing 47 printed pages of documented transactions, each one highlighted and dated in my careful engineering handwriting. I spoke with the branch manager personally, a quiet woman named Miss Aldridge, who listened to me without interrupting for 20 minutes. I explained that I was the primary account holder, that I had reason to believe the secondary account holder had been making unauthorized withdrawals inconsistent with the account's stated purpose, and that I wished to close the account immediately, transfer my remaining balance to a new private account in my name only, and formally document our conversation for my records. Miss Aldridge asked me if I wanted to file a formal fraud report with the bank. I told her I appreciated the offer, but that I had other plans for that documentation. I shook her hand, tucked my new account card into my breast pocket, and drove home to wait. Derek arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I was sitting at my kitchen table reading and had just looked at the clock when I heard his car in the driveway. He did not knock. He opened the front door with the spare key I had given him for emergencies and walked into my house as though he owned the floor beneath his feet. Pamela was right behind him, one hand clutching her phone and the other gripping the strap of the designer bag I had never seen her without. Derek's face was the color of boiled brick. He stood in my kitchen and told me that his debit card had been declined in front of the sales floor manager at a furniture showroom where he and Pamela had been attempting to purchase a custom dining set priced at $11,000. He said the machine had swallowed his card entirely and displayed a message indicating the linked account had been permanently closed. He demanded to know what I had done and why I had done it without calling him first. I did not stand up from my chair. I did not raise my voice. I placed my bookmark carefully between the pages of my book and set it on the table. I looked at my son and asked him a very simple question. I asked him when he had last paid my electric bill. He blinked. He looked at Pamela. He said the bills were on autopay and that I knew that. I stood up slowly and walked to the small filing cabinet in the corner of my kitchen. I opened the second drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printed utility statement from 2 months ago, showing a past due balance of $312, which I had quietly paid myself the same week I began keeping my green notebook. I set the paper on the table in front of him and told him that for a man who had been trusted with $240,000 of his father's life savings, he had managed to let the electric bill lapse on a fixed monthly income. Derek's jaw tightened. He said the oversight had been temporary and that I was being dramatic. He told me I needed to open a new joint account immediately and transfer my money back, or he would have no choice but to speak with my doctor about his concerns regarding my cognitive health. He said it casually, the way a person says something they have been rehearsing for a while, something they have had in reserve for exactly this kind of moment. There it was. The threat was not impulsive. It was prepared. Pamela stepped forward and added her voice to his. She said, they had both noticed I had become increasingly forgetful over the past year. She said I had repeated stories at Christmas dinner. She said I had left the stove on twice, which was entirely false, and I knew it was false, and the steadiness in my own chest surprised me when I heard her say it out loud with such practiced sincerity. She told me they only wanted what was best for me, and that sometimes elderly parents needed guidance from the people who loved them most. I looked at my son. I looked at his wife. I thought about Carol sitting at this same kitchen table, folding Derek's school clothes when he was 9 years old, humming to herself, entirely unaware that the boy she was raising would one day stand in her home and use her death as the opening move in a plan to take everything she and I had built together. I walked back to my bookcase and retrieved the green spiral notebook from behind the row of engineering manuals. I walked back to the kitchen table and set it down open to the first page of documented withdrawals. I told Derek to sit down. He did not sit. He crossed his arms. I told him I was going to explain what I had found, and that he could choose to listen or he could choose to leave, but that either way, the outcome for him was going to be identical. I turned to the first flagged entry in the notebook. I read it aloud. The date, the amount, the corresponding transaction I had traced to a resort hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona, booked during the same week. I had asked Derek if he could help me buy a new water heater, because mine had failed. He had told me money was tight that month. I turned the page and read the next entry, a charge that corresponded to Pamela's dental veneers, which she had mentioned getting done the previous spring, paid for with funds Derek had described to me as a reinvestment opportunity. I read entry after entry, the dates and dollar amounts filling the kitchen with the quiet, irrefutable weight of documented truth. Derek's arms uncrossed somewhere around the 4th page. By the 7th page, he sat down. When I closed the notebook, I told him that $163,000 was gone. I told him the remaining balance, which I had transferred to my private account that morning, was protected by a new account structure he would never access. I told him the notebook was already scanned and stored with my attorney, a man named Robert Falk who specialized in elder financial litigation and who had been expecting my call for 2 weeks. Derek's composure cracked completely. He slapped the flat of his hand against my kitchen table and told me I was not calling any attorney. He told me that if I involved lawyers, he would go to a judge that same week and file for conservatorship on the grounds that I was mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. He said the process was straightforward. He said Pamela's brother-in-law was a physician who had agreed to sign a sworn statement confirming a diagnosis of early-stage cognitive decline based on the concerns Derek had documented in writing over the past several months. He said a judge would look at my age, look at a doctor's signed affidavit, and hand Derek full legal control of my finances before I could finish explaining myself. He thought that threat would end the conversation. He thought the word conservatorship would land on a frightened old man like a ceiling collapsing. I picked up my book from the table, opened it back to my bookmarked page, and told him he had exactly until tomorrow morning to think carefully about what he had just said. I told him to take Pamela and go home. I told him I would be in touch. He stared at me for a long moment, clearly expecting panic he was not seeing. Then he grabbed Pamela by the arm and walked out. The front door closed hard behind them. I sat in the silence for exactly 4 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Robert Falk. Robert is not the kind of attorney who expresses outrage or sympathy as a professional service. He is the kind of attorney who asks for facts in the order they occurred and writes everything down with a mechanical pencil on a yellow legal pad. I had retained him 10 days earlier, the same week I had printed my first set of transaction records, because I understood that preparation is the only thing that separates a man who survives a structural failure from one who gets buried in it. I told Robert about the conservatorship threat, and the physician Derek had claimed was willing to sign a false affidavit. Robert did not pause. He told me there was one immediate priority. Before Derek could file any petition with any court, I needed a certified cognitive evaluation from a state-approved medical board, not a note from my personal doctor. A formal, multi-hour assessment administered by independent evaluators whose credentials and findings would carry legal authority in a courtroom. He had a contact at a licensed evaluation center. He could arrange an emergency appointment for early the following morning. I told him to make the call. I did not sleep that night, in the way most people mean when they use that phrase. I lay down. I closed my eyes. My mind moved through everything the way it used to move through a complicated load calculation before a major project deadline. Methodical. Sequential. Every variable accounted for. I was not afraid. I had spent 40 years working in conditions where a single miscalculation could bring a structure down on the people standing beneath it. I had learned a long time ago that fear is a luxury you cannot afford, when the math still needs to be done. At 7 the following morning, I was seated in a clean, fluorescent-lit room at the Cognitive Evaluation Center, facing 3 board-certified neuropsychologists. The lead evaluator was a tall man with a clipped beard who explained the process without condescension. The battery of tests would take 4 hours. It covered memory retention, processing speed, spatial reasoning, executive function, and emotional regulation under sustained cognitive pressure. He told me the results would be certified by the state medical board and would be legally admissible in any civil or family court proceeding. I told him I was ready. The memory tests came first, a list of words read to me once to be recalled later in precise order. Then spatial orientation tasks, rotating complex geometric shapes mentally, and matching them to their shadows from a provided set of options. For a man who had spent his career reading 3-dimensional engineering schematics by hand, these felt less like a test and more like a Tuesday. The mathematical sequencing portion asked me to perform rapid serial subtractions of irregular numbers from a 4-digit starting point. I completed each sequence without pausing, keeping my eyes level and my breathing even. The final portion was conversational. The lead evaluator asked me to describe in my own words why I believed my family was attempting to gain control of my finances. I did not speak the way a frightened man speaks. I described the documented timeline with the same measured clarity I would use briefing a city engineering committee. I cited specific dates. I cited specific dollar amounts. I named the attorney I had retained and the nature of the legal documentation already in his possession. I told the evaluator that the physician Derek had referenced had never met me, had never conducted an examination of any kind, and that any affidavit bearing that physician's signature would constitute perjury and the filing of false medical documents. The room was very quiet when I finished. After deliberation, the lead evaluator returned and placed the certified results on the table in front of me. I had scored in the 97th percentile for overall cognitive function across all measured categories. The official state medical board affidavit declared me fully and legally competent to manage my own affairs, my own finances, and all decisions pertaining to my estate. All 3 evaluators signed the document. The state seal was pressed into the bottom of the page. I folded the document carefully, placed it inside the interior pocket of my coat, and drove to Robert Falk's office. Robert had not been idle while I was being evaluated. His paralegal had spent the previous evening running a comprehensive background search on Pamela's brother-in-law, the physician Derek had named as his willing accomplice. What she found changed the nature of our response entirely. The physician had twice been subject to state medical board complaints in the past 6 years, both involving improper documentation practices. More critically, he had a documented financial relationship with Derek. The 2 men had been listed as co-investors in a small private holding company registered 18 months ago. Around the same time, Derek had begun accelerating the pace of withdrawals from my savings account. This was no longer a family disagreement about account access. This was coordinated elder financial abuse, supported by a fraudulent medical scheme, executed by 2 men with an established financial partnership and a shared motive. Robert laid out our options with the calm efficiency of a man who had dismantled this kind of structure before. We could wait for Derek to file his conservatorship petition and destroy it in court using the certified evaluation and the documented fraud. Or we could move first. Robert recommended we move first. He filed an emergency injunction that afternoon, preventing Derek from taking any legal action regarding my estate or my finances for 30 days, citing the documented evidence of financial exploitation and the fraudulent nature of the proposed medical testimony. He also formally notified the state medical board about the physician's involvement, triggering an automatic investigative review of the man's license. By the time Derek received the injunction notice at his home that evening, every legal door he thought he had was sealed shut. I learned what happened next from the security camera I had installed at my own front door 6 days earlier. The same week I began the Green Notebook. At 9:47 that evening, Derek's car pulled into my driveway. He sat in the car for 11 minutes without getting out. I watched the timestamp on the footage the following morning. 11 minutes of a man sitting alone in a dark car, trying to find a door that was no longer there. He did not knock. He drove away. 2 days later, I received a call from a number I did not recognize. It was Pamela. Derek did not know she was calling. She spoke quickly, in a low voice, the kind of voice a person uses when they are in another room with the door closed. She told me Derek was unraveling. She said he had not slept. She said he had been making calls to people she did not know, trying to find a way out of what he had built. She said she had not known the full extent of what he had done with my money, that she thought it was manageable, that she had not understood it would go this far. I listened to her without interrupting. Then I told her 3 things. First, that my attorney had already received all the documentation necessary to pursue both civil and criminal charges, and that the decision to file was mine alone to make. Second, that whether or not she had understood the full scope of what Derek was doing, she had accepted the benefits of every dollar he had taken, and had stood in my kitchen and looked me in the eye and fabricated stories about my stove to support a false narrative about my mental health. Third, that if she had genuine information relevant to my attorney's case, she should call Robert Falk's office directly and cooperate fully, because cooperation was the only variable that might influence her own legal exposure. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me if I would consider not pressing charges if Derek returned the money. I told her the money that had already been spent was gone, and that Derek returning what remained would reduce the amount of restitution ordered by a court, but would not change the underlying facts of what had been done. I told her to call Robert. She hung up. Derek called Robert the following morning. He did not offer an apology. He offered a negotiation. He proposed returning $41,000, which was what remained of the funds he had not yet spent, in exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges. He framed it as a gesture of good faith. Robert declined on my behalf and informed Derek that the documentation had already been shared with the county district attorney's office for review of elder financial abuse charges, which in our state carry a mandatory minimum sentence for amounts exceeding $50,000. Derek went silent for 6 days. On the 7th day, he appeared at my door. This time he knocked. I opened it and looked at my son standing on the porch where Carol used to keep her potted geraniums. He had lost weight in his face. His eyes carried the particular hollowed quality of a man who had not slept properly in over a week. He was not wearing the kind of clothes he usually wore. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like an ordinary person. He asked if he could come inside. I stepped back and let him in. I did not offer him coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. He sat across from me. He put his hands flat on the table, the way people do when they want to signal they are not hiding anything. He told me he was sorry. He said it once, clearly, without qualifiers. He did not tell me he was sorry I had found out, or sorry for the misunderstanding, or sorry that things had gone this far. He said he was sorry for what he had done. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep on the couch with his head on Carol's lap. I thought about the man sitting across from me, who had looked me in the eye and threatened to have me locked away from my own life. I told him that I believed he meant the apology in this moment, and that I also knew an apology did not reattach what had been severed. I told him the legal process would proceed. I told him that Robert would be in contact with his attorney about restitution terms, and that cooperating fully with the district attorney was the single most intelligent decision he could make for his own future. I told him that the kind of relationship a father and son might have after something like this, if they were ever to have one at all, would have to be built from nothing, on completely different ground, and that rebuilding was a project for years from now, not today. He nodded. He did not argue. He stood up, pushed his chair in, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and told me that Mom would have handled this better than he deserved. I told him he was right. He left. 3 months later, Derek entered a negotiated plea agreement with the district attorney's office. He was convicted of elder financial exploitation, a felony in our state, and was sentenced to 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory restitution of the full $163,000 to be paid in structured installments garnished from his wages, and 200 hours of community service. His co-investor, Pamela's brother-in-law, lost his medical license following the state board's investigation and faced separate charges for his role in the planned false affidavit, which had never been filed, but for which preparation had been sufficiently documented by Robert's team to support a fraud charge. Pamela filed for divorce 4 weeks after the plea agreement was entered. I did not attend Derek's sentencing hearing. I had said everything I needed to say in that kitchen, at that table. On the afternoon, I laid the green notebook in front of him and let the numbers speak for themselves. A civil engineer does not need to stand in the rubble to confirm the structure has fallen. He calculated the collapse in advance. He simply needed to step back and let gravity do the rest. On the 1st of the following month, I arranged for the house Carol and I had shared for 22 years to be professionally staged and listed with a real estate agent. It sold in 11 days for $38,000 above the asking price. The family who bought it had 3 children and a dog, and the mother had standing in the front yard looking up at the roof the same way Carol used to look at things she was deciding to love. I watched from my car and then drove away. I had already signed a lease on a small stone cottage in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, a place Carol and I had visited once on our anniversary and talked about ever since. The property sat on 2 acres of quiet land above a lake that turned the color of pewter every evening around dusk. There was a workshop in the back where I set up a drafting table, not for any professional purpose, but because drawing lines on paper has always been the way my mind rests. The first evening I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee and watched the light change on the water, I understood something I had been too busy surviving to notice before. The grief I carried for Carol had never been about the house, or the savings, or any of the things that had been fought over. It had been about the absence of someone who saw me clearly and chose to stay anyway. That kind of loss does not respond to legal victories or financial restitution. It simply sits with you quietly until you learn to carry it without it bending your spine. I was carrying it. My spine was straight. If there is anything I want the people watching this to take away, it is not the satisfaction of watching a dishonest person face consequences, though I understand why that is the part of the story that resonates most. What I want you to take away is this. The moment someone uses your grief as a financial opportunity, they have told you exactly who they are. You do not need additional evidence. You do not need to wait for the behavior to become more obvious or more painful before you begin protecting yourself. The documentation I kept in that green notebook was not the product of suspicion. It was the product of clarity. I saw what was happening, and I chose to prepare rather than confront before I was ready. Grief makes people want to believe that the people closest to them are still the people they thought they knew. That instinct is human, and it is understandable, but kindness extended without limits to people who have stopped deserving it is not love. It is a structural flaw waiting to be exploited. Know your own foundation, protect it, and if someone in your life has been quietly undermining it, understand that the most powerful thing you can do is not to yell and demand and threaten. It is to document, prepare, and move with the patience of someone who already knows where the weak points are. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button and leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from, and if you have ever had to make a hard decision to protect yourself from someone you loved, share it. This community exists for exactly that conversation. Subscribe to Voice of Father and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. There are a lot of us out here who needed to hear that protecting yourself is not a betrayal. It is the only honest thing left to do.